Hello, U.S. history students. Welcome. This video is a walkthrough on a key story in this period of Reconstruction, the second half of the 19th century in American history. And I'm not going to try and shine this one up. This is a hard story, and it's a story with all sorts of tragic aspects and elements to it about the end of Reconstruction, the start of something called segregation and the Jim Crow era in the United States. And I will say it is a story that I think the Bible gives us a unique vocabulary and understanding of justice to really unpack and explore and make some sense of this with. I want to walk through this story. We're going to walk through it unafraid, and I want to walk through it using this lens of biblical justice. And that's why there's this exit ticket that's going to ask you, what aspect of biblical justice do you see a greatest need for, or some deeper resonance with in the stories we're going to learn about today. So that's where we're going to start. So I'm going to tell, this chart here is going to sort of tell the story of this lesson. And if you sort of see how we can read these two axes, this axis is like the status of African Americans. From at the bottom would be just enslavement, where it was pre-Civil War. And at the top would be full and equal citizens with the full protections and promises of the law, and then actually being followed through with. And down this axis here is just the passage of time. And the thing we'll start with is that, between the things we learned about last time in the early parts of the Reconstruction period and some of the things that are going to take place at the start of this lesson today, there was a steady improvement in the status of African Americans from being freed from slavery, the Civil Rights Amendments. Things are trending upward in ways that maybe are optimistic or that can make us reasonably feel hopeful. There's some reason to feel hopeful with, Andrew Johnson no longer being president. That was probably good for everybody. And so yeah, in the election of 1868, the Republicans don't even bother nominating Andrew Johnson. They say good riddance. They're happy to replace him with Ulysses S. Grant, who's overwhelmingly popular as the man who saved the Union and won the war. And Grant feels like maybe I can help restore some sanity in an insane situation here. Although, we'll note, Ulysses S. Grant is a political novice. He's new to the political world, and he will have some stumbles. He has what we would call a mixed presidential legacy, students. Pardon me, I have to deal with something here. He has a mixed legacy. There's pluses and minuses. There's good and bad. Let's do the positive first, because I think, frankly, the positive is more significant. Grant is someone who said, I want to reconcile with the South. I want to bring them back in and restore them as full parts of the Union. At the same time, I'm not going to do that by ignoring the status of the freed slaves, ignoring what is to happen to all these African Americans in the South. Like, that's, if the cost of reconciliation is turning my back on African Americans or the freedmen, well, then Grant is just unwilling to take that deal. Let's give him credit for that. And certainly he's unwilling to do this if the cost is ignoring like racial violence across the South. And so when things like we'll talk about in a moment, like the Ku Klux Klan emerges as this sort of like reactionary Southern, racist response to some of these new changes, Grant is like, no. And he uses federal power, his own administration and federal troops, to disrupt and break apart the Ku Klux Klan for a period of time. That's to his credit. And frankly, Grant is the last president for a long time to really stick his neck out on the question of civil rights in the South. Where he has where it gets tricky or complicated is the fact that basically he put the wrong friends in positions of high power. There are issues in his administration of corruption, and that, it got to a cabinet secretary, a key aide, both had to resign in scandals. And Grant just seemed to, I wrote here, have a sleepy response. He just didn't have a very active or, decisive response to it, which is sort of not really in keeping with maybe some of his other character. And those scandals and the steady drip of bad news that hit the newspapers seemed to kind of hurt. It tainted the idea that Republicans had the moral high ground, or the Reconstruction project led by President Grant was sort of seeking the moral high ground and trying to restore something better in the South when his own administration is dealing with corruption. I think as time has passed, historians and later generations have been kinder to the Grant administration than some people were at the time. So here's our story of this period of time. The first, let's say, 5-ish years of Reconstruction saw real progress for the freedmen, for African Americans. They were now citizens of the United States. They were able to vote. Their rights to vote were being protected. And we know that blacks made up a significant chunk of the Southern population. So it's maybe unsurprising that African Americans, it's not just voting, they were being elected to office. We have 2 black senators, 14 black representatives in the House of Representatives. It seemed incredible to many people, like the speed at which this change and this progress was being made. Yet, for many Southerners, these changes were proof that the world had lost its mind, that the government of the United States was trying to say that up was down and left was right and good was bad and black was white, and they just said, look, if the law isn't on our side, if the government isn't on our side, this is white Southerners, white reactionary Southerners thinking, if the government isn't on our side, if the law isn't on our side, if the Constitution's not on our side anymore with these Civil Rights Amendment, then we're just going to have to take matters into our own hands. And you see the emergence of the most notorious terrorist organization in American history, the Ku Klux Klan. And what can you say about the Klan? The Klan sees itself as trying to preserve the virtues of the old ways, preserve the virtues of the sort of pre-war Southern society. And how do you do that? Well, by terrorizing black people, by killing black people, by burning their churches, by attacking or wrecking their schools. And this is also true for whites who were helping the blacks. And the Klan is, I don't want to get into too much of the Klan. Other than to just say it's pathetic and ridiculous and so deeply screwed up and unjust and violent and illegal. And the Grant administration worked to disrupt their efforts, although it's tricky, right? It's tricky to go after the Klan because they're clandestine. They're secretive. They wear these masks, so it's kind of it's sort of an open secret of who's in the Klan, but everybody knows you don't snitch to the feds. You don't snitch to the federal government. And what do you know? It's just so funny how the local law enforcement never just seemed to get down to the bottom of who exactly was in the Klan, who was doing these lynchings, who was doing these attacks. And so it always took federal law enforcement coming in, and then a lot of locals would clam up all of a sudden. So it's really gross. But so the first thing you see is like when these changes are happening for African Americans, that a lot of us go, wow, that's great. Or that seems like the Declaration and the Constitution really coming online. There is a strong terrorist pushback in the form of the Ku Klux Klan. And between this sort of, what happens is after those first 4 or 5 years, this project of Reconstruction just starts to kind of lose steam. And it loses steam for a bunch of reasons. A, because we're impatient. How long is this going to take to restore, to reconstruct the South? 4 years? 5 years? 6 years or 7 years? 8 years? Imagine we're 9 or 10 years later, and there's a lot of Americans, North and South, who are saying, man, looking at their watches, like, how long are we doing this for exactly? How long do we have to do this? How long do we have to be spending all this money, all this energy, all this effort, trying to put together a Southern culture that in some ways seems to stubbornly resist all of this, right? How long are we going to have to do this? We passed some good laws. We made some amendments to the Constitution. Surely that's good enough, right? There are a lot of Americans who are just like, I'm ready to be done. I'm ready to argue about something else. I'm ready to turn the page. The corruption scandals in the Grant administration didn't help because a lot of people were like, oh, Grant administration, you're going to tell the South how they're supposed to live when you can't even clean up your own backyard or your own administration. And certainly a lot of Southerners were like, don't come preaching to us about having the moral high ground when you've got this guy in your administration or that guy in your administration making money off the backs of the taxpayers. Like, you don't get the moral high ground on this. A lot of Southerners saw it sort of like this cartoon we see here. There's a woman in white. It says the solid South. The white is the symbol of Southern virtue, right? And she's being burdened, this terrible burden, this carpet bag. Carpetbaggers were sort of Northerners who came into the South to try and make a buck or, profit off the bad economic situation that Southerners were in. And there's President Grant riding imperiously on this big bag and Northern soldiers holding it aloft. And so the idea was that this whole Reconstruction thing had become a burdensome Northern imposition on the South, and that the North was never going to let it go. And, so Southerners are like, when is enough enough? When are you going to be done forcing this change down our throats? And a lot of Northerners are like, whenever are we going to be done trying to force this change down their throats? Or, man, this is all really expensive, isn't it? And, when the economy takes a downward turn in the 1870s, there's just more and more people. It's not like it all comes to an end at once, but it's just sort of slowly, steadily, support is draining, and more people are saying, let's get the troops out of there. Let's, get rid of some of these expensive things, like the Freedmen's Bureau. And just bit by bit, the project loses steam. And the Grant administration, so here we see like a next stage in this. So there is this initial flush of progress that takes place. And then, we have the emergence of the Klan as part of this reactionary pushback in the South. Reconstruction energy wanes, and this is in the North and the South. And more people are just sort of looking for an exit on this. Can we just call this thing done? Can we say mission accomplished, and just say, let's just go back to a normal country, right? Where we're all united and whatever, and no one's trying to fix half the country. And the basic deal that was on the table, so to speak, was this. It would sound like this. Southerners, if you're willing to reconcile with we Northerners and become patriotic Americans again, and we all just sort of walk into the future reunited, we'll do that. And if the cost of doing that is we don't ask you about what happens to African Americans down South, and the federal government doesn't stick its nose into the business of what's going on down South behind closed doors with regard to the status of African Americans, with regard to lynchings and terror attacks, if we're just sort of willing to stay out of your business on that, but we can sort of reconcile as Americans, then maybe we'll do that. And that is what took place in 1876. There's a messy presidential election, which happens from time to time in American history. And Congress is resolving that, which the Constitution gives the House of Representatives the power to resolve messy election disputes. And the basic deal was this. All right, each party gets something they want. The Republicans get the presidents. They get Rutherford B. Hayes, who's going to be the new president from 1876 to 1880. And Democrats get the promise of federal troops being removed from the South and Reconstruction being declared kind of mission accomplished. All right, we did it. We're taking the troops out of the South. No more federal oversight on this, and we're not going to bring up the race question anymore. And so we're brothers again. We're reconciled, we are reconstructed and restored, and the new policy is just leave them alone down South. And for a lot of Americans, they said, good, we'll save a bunch of money on expensive and maybe silly or maybe impossible kind of government projects. For a lot of Americans then, and frankly today, they just said, oh, good grief. You know what this deal is? This is a political cartoon from the time, but it says compromise with the South. And this is admittedly a little bit hyperbolic. The tone is melodramatic here, but we see Lady Liberty in tears, a Union soldier with a missing leg, sort of having to sort of bow to the Confederate soldier with the chin in the air now. The American flag flies upside down. The African American family in bondage again. And the idea here, what's being sold is the idea of like, when you make this deal and you call a half-done project done and you say we're not going to bring up the race stuff anymore, you just gave it away. You gave way too much away here in the end. It's like the mistake that Lincoln refused to make at the end of the Civil War of like, we could stop fighting now, but if we let them keep their slaves, it's like we can stop the Reconstruction project, before it's really legally settled in, and that's what happened. And so the status of African Americans in the South takes a terrible, terrible nosedive after this point, after 1876. So we have this upward trend for a while, and then in the last 25 years or so of the 19th century, there's a deterioration for African Americans, for Black people in the South. Let's be clear, they are no longer enslaved. Nothing's as bad as slavery. It's not like it was back to slavery. So I always want to be clear, because I don't want to say what happens next is as bad as slavery, because of course it's not, but it's no good. It's deeply unjust. It's deeply un-American. And where this process begins is saying, we got to find a way to stop Black people from voting. Once we can stop them from voting, we can put in place any sort of kinds of laws we want, right? Because we'll then have politicians. Politicians listen to voters, boys and girls. That's what politicians do. They will listen to voters. If we can prevent Black people from voting, that means politicians in the South don't have to listen to Black folks. And they can just listen to the white Southerners who want things done a certain way. And so we see the passage of all of these voting restriction laws in Southern states. And these worked, the 15th Amendment says you can no longer say a person is forbidden from voting based on their race. Okay, you can't say that, but you can say other stuff. You can pass a poll tax that says if you want to vote, you got to pay this tax. You got to pay this fee. Pay a one-time fee of $100, $150, $200, whatever that is, adjusted for inflation. And for most folks, a lot of folks, that's, it's a fee, it's some money, but it's worth doing, or it's not the end of the world. But for poor folks, that's the groceries for the week. That's money that is essential. And so what poll taxes did was they effectively prevented poor people from voting, and African Americans were disproportionately poor. Now, of course, this also kept poor whites from voting. Not many Southern whites really lost much sleep over that, so that means whatever. Some white trash folks can't vote. Well, gee, too bad. I guess that's just the cost of preventing African Americans from voting, right? Literacy tests. And literacy tests sounds common sense, I suppose. It says before you vote, you just got to go into the voter registration place. And in order to register, you need to demonstrate that you understand how the Constitution works or answer a couple questions about it. But in effect, what that meant is if you're a Black person, you're going to go in and you got to read, the dense text of the Constitution, and they can make it as hard on you as they want. If you're a Black person, what that meant is you're probably not as well educated, because it was difficult to get educated down south. And you just got to sit around, and the good old boys will ask you a couple questions, and there'll be some snickering, right? And if you don't get it exactly right, there'll be some laughing, and they'll say sorry, if they even bother to treat you politely, and you'll be sent away. And if you're a white person, they can kind of help you through. They can say, well, here's Article 1 of the Constitution. Does it seem like this is sort of saying that Congress has the power to make treaties, or Congress has the power to, pass a new tax law, blah, 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 and they can help you through or they can not help you through. And so a literacy test has the impact of making it harder to vote if you're Black. A grandfather clause, now this is a totally ridiculous sort of law, and it only was passed in a couple Southern states. Louisiana, I forgot all of them, so I should be careful, but the idea of a grandfather clause said, hey, we Southern states like things in a certain way, and so we want voting rights here to be for people who really have deep roots here. So you are eligible to vote here if your grandfather was eligible to vote here. And if you're Black, of course your grandfather wasn't eligible to vote because your grandfather was a slave. And so it just meant if you're Black, by definition, you weren't going to be allowed to vote. And all this is like, these are the legal ways Blacks were prevented from voting. But let's note, there's another illegal or informal way, which is just, again, the good old boys who are going to hang around the voting place or the registration place. And when you arrive, they're going to make you feel threatened, right? Maybe overtly, like this guy's pointing a gun at your head, or maybe it's just, you walk through the door and they say, hello, Bill, or they'll call you by your full name. which might sound neighborly to you, but I'd say in this context, when they're sitting there and that's where you're going in, they're saying, hey, we know who you are. If you really want to vote, we know who you are and we can find you and we can make sure that you experience some consequences for this. So look, you know what happens across the South? Black people, because they're sensible and bound by reality, stop voting. In 1894, there were 130,000 blacks registered to vote in Louisiana. By 1904, 10 years later, there's 1,300. You know what voting restrictions do? They work. They stop black people from voting. And you just throw one obstacle after the next, And yeah, I know the 15th Amendment said you can't prevent people from voting based on race, but these are sort of informal ways, or these are ways, none of them say, it's because you're black, but that's certainly the way they're designed, is to prevent blacks from voting. And once they can't vote, then again, politicians and lawmakers don't have to listen to them. And so what happens after the right to vote is restricted is we see the imposition of these segregation laws. And this is just some nasty, nasty stuff. And the idea of segregation laws is, let's turn our communities into like a weird racist Disneyland, where yes, we have minority groups, we have African Americans in our community, but they will be filtered out and separated from white folks. And they know already the informal stuff. If I'm a white man, they know not to look me in the eye. They know to call me sir, no matter what I call them. They know that, they know the informal rules of how they need to treat me culturally. But now segregation just says, I'm going to make sure that we can have a deal where I can live with black folks in my community. And the only time I really have to interact with them is when they're asking me questions like, may I take your order, sir, right? Or how can I fix your car, or what, all that sort of stuff, like some sort of service industry thing. And there's a clear, like, I'm in power and they're not. And now we know how to act. And then even I can be perfectly pleasant or whatever, and I can even feel like, see, I'm humane, or I'm kind, I'm not part of the problem. And everyone sort of knows how to play this role. In the meantime, they also know, they'll be on a different side of the street from me. They're going to walk in different entrances of buildings from me. They're going to sit in different areas of a theater, different areas of a restaurant. They're not going to swim in the same water at the beach with me. They're not going to swim in the same swimming pool with me. They're not going to go to the same library as me. They're not going to go to the same school as me. They won't be in the same hospital floor with me. And when I send my kiddos to school, I don't have to live with the existential dread that my daughter's going to be sitting next to a black kid. Right? That's how segregation works. This sort of racist Disney role of just separating everything out. It's super artificial. It's a crazy government imposition, actually. You want to talk about like crazy government overreach and government programs to tinker with social rules. This is like the all-time example. But over time, it came to be seen as kind of natural, or like a way of life. Or I guess if you're going to talk about a Southern defense of it, sort of like they just said, look, everyone gets along better when everyone knows their place. Everyone gets along better when everyone knows the rules. They know where they fit. We know where we fit. We seem happier. They certainly look happier. It's all on a superficial level, totally pleasant. All right? It might look weird to you outsiders. This is kind of how we do life down here. And from that point of view, maybe you say, yeah, it is kind of like a Disneyland, until you just say, well, how does this feel from an African-American perspective? And then you go, oh. And so, at the end of our story, we see a precipitous drop in the status of African-Americans in the last quarter century of the 20th century. And as that energy wanes, Reconstruction is declared a done deal. Voting restrictions set in, and these so-called Jim Crow laws or segregation laws are set in place. It's really tragic and awful. And I just finished with a quick note. You might be saying, this seems unconstitutional, right? Didn't the 14th Amendment promise equal protection under the laws? And I'd say it did. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court saw it a little differently. In 1896, there was a Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And Plessy versus Ferguson, I'm not going to get into the details of the case, but it said it's okay for states and municipalities, cities to segregate as long as facilities are equal. If you're offering them the same bathrooms as blacks as white folks, if you're offering them the same railroad cars as white folks, then the same libraries as white folks, then it's okay to segregate. There's nothing inherently discriminatory about saying you just have to have different facilities. It's nothing inherently discriminatory about saying you black folks can't be in the same swimming pool as we white folks. Now, I would disagree with that, but that was the court's reasoning at the time. And it's really important to say that principle of as long as facilities are equal, that was just never enforced. All right, this is sort of just like covering fire given to the idea of segregation. This was never particularly well enforced. And what it meant was that it establishes this idea of separate but equal. There's nothing unequal. There's nothing, against the 14th Amendment with segregation laws. There's nothing in violation of the Declaration of Independence with segregation laws. It's just separate but equal. And once the Supreme Court ruled that, then a number of other states jump in with these segregation laws, and those laws would remain in place until 1964, until my mom was in 6th grade. And we'll talk about how that finally came to an end, but it's fair to say that these lasted for way, way too long. So students, as we finish up your work, I'd like you to please do the scrapbook about this slide today and complete that exit ticket as well. I want to thank you for your engagement with this lesson, and I'll see you next time.